Has this been officially?
You did
named?
show up.
Okay.
Everybody took a bet you wouldn't show.
Where'd the mayor go?
So, I want to welcome everybody to the City Council budget hearing for May 29th, 2018. It is 6 p.m. And tonight we're going to have presentations of Planning, Code, and Conservation Commission, and that will be presented by Dean Therian, the Director of Planning Department and Community Development. So, Dean, you can have the floor.
Good evening, councilors.
Oh, wait, and one other thing, that we do have a quorum here for our meeting. Thank you.
We don't need to do a roll call.
Can we do a roll call?
I can do a roll.
Why don't you do a roll call, please?
Okay.
I kind of was put into this quick here.
Counselor Cheney,
Here.
Counselor Bounds,
Here.
Counselor Littman, Counselor Hamel,
Here.
Counselor Haynes.
Here.
Counselor Hosba.
Okay, we do have a quorum. There are 4 counselors here.
I want to note for the first time that I've been sitting on the city council, that there were 4 votes of here and no votes of present.
That's right. And we have Scott Myers and Donna Wooderman, our finance director. Thank you. Got to go through the technicalities, Dean.
Yep, I understand. No problem. Good evening, councilors. My department has 3 distinct facets to it. It's the planning and community development, the code enforcement, and the conservation. And I'll go through each one separately so that you can get a flavor of what's going on. You do have a handout on your desk. I'm going to start with conservation, and in the budget book, that is pages 42 through 44. Proposed budget is $4,500. That's the right number of zeros there. It's a very small budget. It's primarily to support the Conservation Commission activities. It's basically level funded. I think it's $80 more this year than it was last year. Conservation Commission advises the Planning Department and the Planning Board and other city departments on such things as stormwater management and wetlands protection, all designed to protect the lakes and their tributaries. This includes CUPs, conditional use permits, which go before the Planning Board. They advise the Planning Board on what kind of conditions they might want to suggest to an applicant to do something, say, in a wetland buffer or to fill a wetland. They would also might need some New Hampshire DES permits as well to do that. They also act as the Conservation Commission, along with our conservation technician, will give erosion control advice to anyone in the city who's doing anything that's disturbing ground, whether it's a full-fledged development or someone just wants to create a little bit bigger backyard. They may need to take some steps to make sure that when they disturb the soil and you get a rainstorm or whatever, we don't have soil and whatever else running off into the streams and then eventually making their way to the lakes. The conservation technician's salary is contained in the planning budget, so this is the primary reason that the $4,500 is sufficient to sustain the Conservation Commission. One of the other things the Conservation Commission and the technician are involved in is the milfoil control. And the dollars for the milfoil control come from grants and fundraising, and also some money that's been left over from previous year's appropriations. This year they are scheduled to do milfoil control in 4 different areas in Paugus Bay, not all at the same time, but at staggered times over the course of the summer months. The primary reason that they're staggering is to keep the levels low enough so they're not affecting the drinking water. As everybody knows, the intake of the drinking water is in Paugus Bay, in the middle of Paugus Bay. So that's pretty much the conservation budget. Any questions on that? All right, moving on to code enforcement.
Pardon my tardiness. I apologize to you.
No problem. Code enforcement on the budget books is page 37 through 40. The proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year is $139,440. It's a slight decrease from the current year. The reason for that primarily is just the way the salaries are going to work out this year in terms of we have a new Building inspector, he's at the lower end of the salary scale as opposed to the previous building inspector, which was at the higher end. That's the primary difference between the reason for the slight decrease. Code enforcement is 2 full-time people and one part-time. And as I just mentioned, we have recently hired a new building inspector that will be full-time in-house. This will be this is currently the first time since I've been here, which is 17 months, that we've had a full-time in-house building inspector. The previous building inspector had was injured on the job and was out for quite some time. Code department activities primarily are permits, which include the building permits, electrical permits, demolition, certificates of occupancy, and of course with all of those permits come inspections. Some of those permits will require multiple inspections. A building permit, for instance, for a new house would require a couple of inspections during the foundation phase, rough framing, rough electrical, and then we'd have to go back and do insulation and then the finished stuff. So depending upon the complexity of the project, could require multiple inspections. Code Department also supports the Heritage Commission and the Building Code Board of Appeals. And the other aspect of Code Department is the property maintenance. Property maintenance is inspecting properties primarily from a visual or maintenance type of situation. And we do that by complaints that we receive, either from neighbors or other people. Sometimes I know the councilors will call up the city manager and convey their displeasure about certain properties, and guess who gets that? I get that phone call, which is fine. We will do a visual inspection of however we receive the complaint, and sometimes we're just driving by and we see them. We send out violation letters, and then we will do court action on occasion if necessary. A lot of the times, things that we see or get complaints about that people think are property maintenance issues are sometimes zoning issues instead. Sometimes they're a combination of things. Sometimes a given property will have a property maintenance issue and also have a zoning issue at the same time. So we work very closely within the office. The different staff members will coordinate their activities and try to direct, deal with the property owner in kind of a cohesive action. Code property maintenance issue is very difficult. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it. When we send out a violation letter, kind of goes, property owner's reaction kind of goes into one of 3 categories. One is they're embarrassed that they got a letter saying your property is in such and such condition, and they want to take care of it as soon as they can. And we have another group of people that get that letter and do nothing. And we have another group that will get the letter and will want to do something, but because of lack of money or ability or whatever, they fall into a different category. So that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with. We would hope that everybody takes pride in their property as much as we all would like everyone to do, and it's probably as we all do as homeowners. We would like that to occur across the board. Unfortunately, that's not the situation. We do have a tendency to have repeat offenders. They'll clean up, and it'll be clean for a while, and they'll take care of the issue, and then the issue comes back. So we're constantly rechecking. People that we have dealt with before, we constantly go back and recheck on our own. We don't have to wait for another complaint. We'll do that. I mean, if we get another complaint, that's fine, but we don't necessarily wait. We do a constant recheck of things like that.
Can we take a question?
Sure.
So what you just enumerated, in terms of what the council could do in terms of changing rules or ordinances to make the job a little easier. I understand that when you go to court proceedings, you're subject to New Hampshire law, which protects property rights and its objective. But I guess what could we do ministerially or policy-wise to make your job easier in that regard?
Well, you're right about the courts, and the other aspect about the courts is they take into consideration the ability of the property owner to either pay a fine or to pay the money to fix up their property, and in many cases there's no money there. So you can't get blood out of a stone, and the courts are very reluctant to do anything with those kind of individuals. When it's absentee landlords and those kinds of things, we have a little bit more traction. Throughout the property maintenance code, which the city has adopted, and throughout various aspects of our zoning code, we have a number of places that call out for fines for people who don't comply. But we, as a department, can't issue those fines. It's not like a parking ticket, that kind of a thing. We can only issue the fines through the court. And my experience has been that they're very reluctant to do that. They would rather get some traction with the property owner than do that. As I think overall that we would as well. I mean, the issue of fines.
District Court or Superior Court?
It's both, depends upon what the situation is, whether it's zoning or whether it's code, and just what a violation is. It could be district court, it could be Superior.
So you've told me why we can't. How about what we could do?
Well, we've been looking at that. As far as I know, we don't have the authority to enact an ordinance that would allow us to just unilaterally, impose the fines, because I don't think the legislature has given us the authority to do that. So, that would be one aspect. If we could get our legislative delegation perhaps to sponsor some type of state law that would do the enabling legislation. We can't be I know we're not the only city or town for that matter in New Hampshire that has this problem. Every city has this problem, whether it's zoning violations or whether it's code, property maintenance violations. They all have the same problem, and they all have the same enforcement issues. So that would be a major point. Short of that, just a cohesive policy support from the council, from the administration, that this is the action that we want to take, so that we can point and say, not only is it an ordinance, but we're being told by, the city fathers that this is the direction that we want to go.
Councilor Hamel has a
Yeah, it's kind of following up on what Henry said. The absentee landlords, we're hearing from another department that's kind of like a big issue. And I think at one time, quite a long time ago, this council spoke about, I don't know if we ever really did anything about it, I can't remember, about having a person locally that we could get a hold of if there was an issue, instead of the person that might live in New York or wherever. I can't quite remember if we passed that or not. I don't think we did. But I mean, is that something we could do to help with that? That some kind of ordinance that says to these absentee landlord people that you have to have a person that we can get a hold of within a certain amount of time to address a situation at a particular home, or apartment or whatever.
Kind of a property manager type.
Yeah, exactly.
Contact.
There's they got managers for these big,
Right.
complexes and stuff, but the 5-6 units at certain streets and stuff, they.
I think there was a piece of legislation passed a few years ago, and I'll have to research it tomorrow to get you the exact RSA, that required somebody that had a certain number of units either to be within a reasonable proximity, distance within miles to be contacted, or barring that, they needed to provide the municipality with a name and a phone number of the responsible person. So let me reference that RSA for you, and I can share it with the council once we
And
find it.
also, Dean, you were talking about demolition permits and things like that. I guess we kind of had a little bit of a oops situation
We did.
recently. What I'm wondering is, part of that application for the demo permit, is there a box, or could a box be put on there that if a building is, 50 years old or more, that you have to go in front of the Heritage Commission?
Yeah, that checkbox is already there.
It is already there.
It is already
Okay.
there,
So it did
and-
get checked off for this particular
And
thing?
I take responsibility for overriding that, and at the time, I thought that was the right decision, and, sorry, but.
So, but I mean,
won't
there
happen
is
again.
a place on there that has to be checked off?
Yes,
to go
yeah,
through
if
the
it's more than,
process?
50 years old or over a certain square footage, or if it's a certain square footage and over 50 years old, then yes, it should go to the Heritage Commission.
Okay, very good. I just wanted to be sure that was on there.
Counselor Littman?
So, float this idea out in terms of being able to, in instances where someone can't make a repair, that if we want to establish a fund to make repairs and take out a lien to recapture that, where we thought it was an important situation to address relative to the underlying property values. I mean, if a property is depressing all the property values of a neighborhood, we're losing out anyways, and we're losing twice. We got an ugly, dilapidated property, and everybody else's property is worth less than it otherwise would be. Is there anything that we could research around that end that might help us?
So I know prior to Dean coming here, we did have at least one property and maybe a second one where it was just an abandoned property, and it was a situation where we could not contact the owner. And after a lengthy process, and I recall we were placing ads in a California newspaper because that was the last known address, we were able to get court permission after quite an expense up front and quite a length of time to go in and do some outside of the house property maintenance, just growth and cleaning up and that type of stuff, and then put a lien on it. But again, you're not going to do that without going through the process with the courts. One other example, if I can, going back to Councilor Hamel and the demo permit, as the council is aware, back earlier in this winter, you authorized a letter to be sent to a property owner on Franklin Street for cleanup and that type of stuff. And we've been in close contact, and that property is just about to change hands. The contractor went and did the inspection. It's not salvageable. There's a case of a property owner who wasn't their primary residence. I don't know how they acquired it, but that property is in significant disrepair. She's going to sell it. The contractor's going to buy it. He's planning on demoing it. So the unique part was it's over 50 years old, and here it is, the neighbors want to get it down right away, and the developer was saying, I've got a rig coming off of a job over here, and it's going to Tilton, and on the way, I want to get in and demo that house. So we're actually trying to be proactive. We got that on the Heritage Commission as an under other business 2 weeks ago, so if this guy shows up for his demo permit, which the neighbors all want, and everybody wants the house to come down, we don't have to say, well, we've got to wait for the Heritage Commission to meet, and they've got 30 days in which to act upon this. So we understand the value of the Heritage Commission and what they bring to the picture, but sometimes it can cause some challenges for us, too.
Exactly.
And Dean, you've got a couple of employees going to a training coming up.
Yeah, next week, it's training on code enforcement and zoning enforcement. The new building inspector is going to go to that, and Rob was here, there he is our zoning technician. He's been with the city just about a year, so he's going to go as well. Hopefully we'll pick up some tips on some ways that other communities are handling the same situations
So
that we
did
have.
you cover prior to my arrival, and I won't ask you to recover it, but did you cover the note in here about outside contract? Page 40. Talking about the funding of the building inspector position.
Right.
Did you explain that?
Yeah, we have a new building inspector.
Who is an employee or who is not an employee?
He is an employee. He is an employee. He started about 2 weeks ago. Prior to that, And for about 16 months, we had a contract individual because the building inspector prior to this was out on disability from an on-the-job injury.
What do you mean by this may continue into fiscal 19, or is that
Well,
outdated?
at the time when I wrote that,
Okay.
wasn't sure where we were going to be and everything else. But as of now, we have a full-time city employee doing building inspections.
All right, as a follow-up to the two counselors, like we're all aware of the fact that we get a significant number of complaints from people about why we're not enforcing more strenuously the city codes on building appearance and whatnot. So if one assumes that we're not doing, for whatever reason, all we could, is that, how much of that, what percentage-wise, I know I'm asking for a guess, how much of that is due to staffing issues and as opposed to bureaucracy, administration, whatever?
I would say over the past year or so that some of that is staffing issue. The contract person that we had to do inspections was not doing anything about property maintenance or anything over and above. I mean, you know, if somebody took out a building permit, he went and did the inspections. And that was the extent of what they were doing. So we were missing some of the extra inspections, particularly in property maintenance. The joint effort that code enforcement used to do with the fire department for joint inspections on particularly subsidized housing units. We have not been doing that for some time. And we're going to be gearing that up again in a few weeks. I want to get the new employee kind of into the process and him knowing what's going on and starting to get with a flow of things.
How many hours a week was the contractor?
It varied depending upon need. It was, they were charging a flat fee per inspection, but they were doing 90 minutes to 3 hours a day, depending upon how many inspections we had lined up on any given day.
And this new employee is full-time?
Full-time. Yep.
So was there, in the run-up on the budget process, was there any discussion, I'm asking you at the same time here, I guess, city manager, was there any discussion about adding another person in that area?
We did have a brief discussion, the city manager and myself, about whether we wanted to convert the code enforcement staff member that's half-time, that's part-time, whether we wanted to convert that to full-time or not. As you know, it's not just a matter of covering the increase in salary. Then we're talking, you know, covering New Hampshire retirement system and probably a medical plan and everything else that goes along with it. We did briefly talk about that. I really don't believe that we need to expand that position to do what we need to do. I think it's a matter of better managing the time, and I think that we can better do that now that we have a full-time building inspector. We can kind of tag team the issues. So I don't see that we need additional staffing to do that. I just think it's a matter of, now that we have the full staff again, being able to utilize that in a better way.
Councilor Bounds?
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on this just a little, and I guess that having an in-house, full-time position working is going to improve the situation rather than 90 minutes to 3 hours a day with respect to this. And I'm not disagreeing with you that the staffing needs, that you think that the staffing needs can be adequate for the future. I'm just asking that we keep some kind of track on this, and that if there is a need for it, that you let us know so that we can do something about it. I, along with everybody else in this council, I think, would like to reduce, I know we're not going to eliminate, but would like to reduce the number of complaints that we receive about our code enforcement issues, whether it's absentee landlords, whether it's downtown issues with respect to safety, that kind of stuff. So I'm just asking you for some kind of tracking. I don't expect you to spend a lot of time on it, and I don't expect you to do anything but your job, but I would like to cut down on some of these code enforcement complaints.
Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And we've heard that message loud and clear. Part of the challenge we had for this past 18 months is with the worker out on a work-related disability and injury, we had to go through the process of reviews by medical and doctor, and the person was finally declared not able to come back to the position. But in the interim, we couldn't fill that position with a new city hire because if somewhere in that 18-month period they were deemed fit to come back to duty, we had to get that position back for them, and then what do we do? So it wasn't the perfect solution, but finding an inspector who came in and just took care of the building inspections to keep those projects going, while at the same time complying with the law that if this person was deemed fit to come back, we had a position for them. That's the challenge of a very small department. So part of it was our property maintenance person was covering some of the added hours, helping out with the building inspection, paperwork, and that type of stuff. And it was just a ripple effect. When you have a very small department and you're losing a full-time and only replacing them for scheduled inspections, you know, there's not a lot of room for coverage there with very few people in there. So I agree with Dean. I think we're in a good spot. I think once the new hire gets up to speed, we'll assess it, and if we find out that we are in a position where we still could use more help, we'll gladly bring that to the council.
All right, any other questions on code? All right, moving on to the planning aspects. That's on page 77 through 81 of your budget books. Proposed budget is $234,310, an increase of about $21,000, mostly due to salary adjustments for COLAs, not all of it, but a lot of it. Within the planning department budget is 5 full-time people, including myself, and 1 part-time person. Planning activities, of course, are support of the boards and commissions, and they are the Planning Board, the Zoning Board of Adjustment, Conservation Commission, the Technical Review Committee, the Minor Site Plan Committee, and the Special Events / Motorcycle Week Committee. All of those boards require, minutes to be taken at their meetings. A lot of them require public hearings to be posted, not only in the newspaper but in the usual places that we post our public hearings. Requires minutes to be written and lots of paperwork that goes with all those reviews and cases that all these different boards hear, and that's a goodly portion of what the staff is doing on a week-to-week basis. From my standpoint, my role is to advise the boards, particularly planning and zoning, on how they should be approaching the various applications, to make sure that they are following the proper procedures and to make sure that they are making the decisions that we deem to be in the best interest of the city. Now, having said that, I'm not a voting member of any of those committees, so I can advise, and sometimes they will take our advice and sometimes they don't. So having said that, though, I think it's a pretty good working relationship. I think it's a work in progress, but I think we're making progress, and I thank you for your recent efforts to fully populate the planning board. This will be the first time since I've been here that we've had a full complement of regular members, and we have 3 alternate members. We've always been almost either none or 1 alternate member, and we've been down 1 or 2 members of regular members for many months. So I greatly appreciate the fact that we have a full board, and I think that will help a lot. The other thing that we do on a regular daily basis in the planning office is to advise property owners about regulations. People come in all the time and say, I want to do this, or I'm thinking about doing that. Can I do this? What are my setbacks? What are my requirements? And those kinds of things. We advise people on the zoning regulations, on density requirements. Sometimes people have a 2-unit, they want to make it a 3-unit. They maybe can't do that in the zone they're in. Maybe their lot is not big enough to accommodate that, so we'll work with them on that. We also deal with signs. We have people coming in and talking about potential development on a regular basis or redevelopment opportunities. The old mill building back here across the river, probably have, since I've been here, we've probably had 5 or 6 people come in and say, I'm thinking about buying the building. Here's what I'm thinking about doing with it, and you know, can I do this or can I do that? And we will let them know whether they can or they can't, or how they could do it, and what the other regulations that they're looking at, parking, and what kind of uses they can put in the building and those kinds of things. We've had a lot of tire kickers for that particular building. Nobody's bought it yet that I know of. But there are 3 or 4 other properties in the downtown area that people are in on a fairly regular basis asking about. So there's interest out there. Nobody's pulled the trigger yet that I know of, but there certainly is interest out there in trying to rehab and reuse some of the larger buildings that have been vacant for some time. We're also working very heavily with the State Commission on the former state school property. The good news is that they have preliminarily anyway 3 different kinds of proposals for their quote master plan or not master plan, but their projected likely uses for the site. And their second proposal that they came up with is very close to the concepts that we came up in the process of formulating the master plan over the past couple of years. Mixed-use type development. That's the basic kind of concept that's in the master plan, and that's one of their 3 scenarios that they've been talking about. We will continue to work with them on that. We have another meeting coming up next week with them, and of course they're doing a presentation here on June 6th, I think it is, to do a public hearing type thing. Also want to highlight that the master plan has finally been adopted by the planning board after all the time that I've been here, and then for quite some time before that, people were formulating the update to the master plan. We have the 2018 vision statement and land use chapter. Now that that's been adopted, we're going to start working at the planning board level to revising the various rules within zoning, and also potentially revising some zone boundaries, kind of the things that we talked about in the master plan in terms of consolidating downtown zones and those kinds of things. The classic example, and I know some of you have heard this, but the classic example that I use, particularly in the downtown area when we're talking about the different zones, this, depending upon how you define the downtown, you've either got 5 or you've got 9 different zoning zones. It depends upon how far out you want to go. But the classic example of why I think we need to have one zone for the downtown is Canal Street. If you're on the southerly side of Canal Street, that's one zone, and it has its own regulations, including sign regulations. If you're on the north side of Canal Street, you're in a different zone, you have different signs, different sign sizes. So it's very unfair to the different merchants. And the same thing happens on Main Street versus Beacon Street West and everything else. So suffice to say that this is kind of the thing I think we need to correct, among other things. The emphasis of the master plan, in just a few words, is redevelopment of existing properties and controlled new development in certain areas. And the certain areas that we're really emphasizing, not that we want to discourage any development, but the emphasis is on mid-price ranged housing and economic development to try to get some jobs back into the city. And then the other thing that we can do now that we have vision statement and land use chapter is we can start work on the other master plan chapters. Some of them have various draft forms that were done a couple of years ago that we need to update, and then make sure we don't have any contradictory statements between things that were written a couple of years ago and things that we have in the current land use chapter. We don't want to have any contradictions there, so we got to work through that. That is basically planning in a nutshell. Any questions on that?
Counselor Hamel?
Quick question, Dean. When we select someone and put them on the planning board, is there any kind of in-house training that you do with these individuals before they sit in the chair so that they know the laws and the rules and those kinds of things? Because if they don't have much experience or whatever, and they get to sit in the seat, I mean, you could be voting for something that
They could, right off, absolutely. What I've been doing is all the newer members, and I haven't got to all of them yet because some of them have just got appointed within the past couple of weeks, but I hope to get to all of them before the next meeting, is have them come into the office and sit down with me, and I will go over, give them a package of information, which includes our zoning rules and regulations, the procedures for the planning board, the relevant state laws, and not all of the relevant state laws, but the 2 or 3 that are particularly pertinent to the planning board. Kind of go through procedure and process with them, give them an idea of how they're supposed to behave on the planning board in terms of it's a public meeting, decisions are made in public. We're not talking about the case outside of meetings and those kinds of things. So I have been doing that, and we'll continue to do that with the more recent members that are coming on board. We also have, through New Hampshire Municipal Association, an opportunity to schedule some training for land use boards, and I think at that case we will bring in all the land use boards at one time and kind of get most bang for our buck. You know, zoning board, Conservation Commission, Heritage Commission, everybody come in and get the latest state laws and the updates to the state laws and procedures and the gotchas that are common across the state that they can enlighten us and try to get people on the same page.
Is that something that is done locally? People come here to do that?
Yeah, we can get them to come here, yes. Yeah, and we can also tailor the program to be maybe a little more specific for what we perceive our needs to be as opposed to just kind of a generic class.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Is the legal expenses incurred by the planning department, planning process are lumped in with everybody else's budget? Or
Yes, we carry legal in a separate department that comes under, or separate budget that comes under administration budget that I'll be going over, I think, at our next budget meeting. So legal is lumped together, we don't break it out.
Okay, for what it's worth, I have long believed, long before your time or Mr. Meyer's time, have believed that the city was negligent, that may be too strong a word, for not having legal counsel attend potentially contentious or litigious meetings of the planning board or the zoning board to advise the board on what they're doing or not doing that will keep us out of court. And, I mean, I know it's, for example, on the zoning front, I know ZBA front, I know that it's pretty common practice in lots of parts of the state to have an attorney at all ZBA meetings at the municipality's expense, and we have never done that. You know, there are just times when it's painful to watch the decision-making process in terms of how far they stray from what I view anyway as the legal process that they should be following.
Understood, Mr. Mayor, and depending upon the board, my level of being able to offer advice varies because of the way different boards are governed by different laws. I have much more ability to offer input to the planning board, for example, as a meeting is going on. From a zoning board standpoint, it really should be a situation where if they ask for advice, then I can give it. Otherwise, I should not be influencing potentially anyway, the board's decision, but I understand what you're saying, and point is well taken.
It is what it is, I guess. I just think that, I mean, the training issue is a big part of it, I think, in terms of them really understanding what their role is and what their role isn't, more importantly. Anyway, I won't belabor it, but I think we've all seen even recent examples where members of the boards have strayed into dangerous territory.
Mayor, I'd like, if I could, just to go back to code enforcement for a moment.
Sure.
I'd like to sort of emphasize what Counselor Bounds said and ask if it's possible that perhaps we had a quarterly report on the maintenance and property maintenance, code enforcement, how much activity has occurred over a quarter. And I say that because I don't know if I can speak for the other two new guys, but I suspect I do. One of the things I get the most calls about is, how come there's 13 junk cars in that guy's yard? And, you know, and that's state law. I mean, that's not city ordinance. That's 2 or more unregistered vehicles are considered a junkyard. And that's been pointed out to me by dozens of people. So I wonder if we could ask for, on a quarterly basis, what have we viewed, what have we done, you know, what action have we taken? If that would be possible, I think I'd feel better knowing what's going on.
Counselor Haynes.
I support what Bruce is saying. Over the weekend, I got 4 calls. And one personal, and one was well, I had 3 calls and one was a personal visit, so,
On Memorial Day weekend?
on Memorial Day weekend.
We can certainly put something together and try to track and give you, status on updates on what came to resolution, which ones we're having challenges with, which one we're taking to court. Maybe not name them by property address, but give you categories, and we'll work on something, and we can certainly tweak it as we go along to meet your needs.
I just want
Okay, Counselor Haynes?
Can I go back to the Conservation Commission just
Sure.
for a minute? Durkee Brook, have we finally cleaned that up?
We're in the
Best
process.
knowledge.
They're in the process. It seems like, we no sooner go out and get it cleaned up, and then, a couple of months go by, and there's stuff back in it. And so it's kind of a never-ending battle, but...
Yeah. Some of the landowners think that that's a dump.
Yes, exactly, right. And we have contacted a couple of the landowners out there that dumping of leaves and whatever else that's been
Any
going out
part
there.
of the
that-
brook in particular?
It's right about by Union Cemetery, I guess.
Yeah.
That's one of the complaints that I got. But that was about last fall.
Yeah, no, it's been an ongoing issue. We had a property owner that was closer to the busy corner square there that was
Okay.
putting stuff into the brook, so, yeah.
Counselor Bounds?
Yeah, I just want to comment on your comments, Mr. Mayor, about having an attorney there present to give advice.
Other than you, of course.
What a good attorney.
I will be candid that would be a bad decision to let me do that.
Agree with you on that.
A lot of the times, it's really not necessary, and you can look at what's coming up on the agenda and make a determination of which projects are going to be controversial with some confidence, so that if you want to do something like that, and you think it's necessary, you can isolate the projects and council's involvement on a short-term or a long-term basis in terms of those meetings, and they don't necessarily have to be there for every one of the meetings in terms of what's going on. So that's just my comment on that in
I
terms
would
of
agree with that. Could be
So-
done on a selective basis, but to me, there's just some obvious ones that,
There are, but you'd be surprised, my batting average of trying to predict ahead of time, okay, we got this case and we got this case, and this should smooth, sail right through and shouldn't take any time, and then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, on a particular case, you get bogged down, you just don't.
one common denominator is any case you have that is gonna produce a full house of neighbors is probably a good idea to,
And there's times where it doesn't matter what you do, that case is going to court. That's where it's destined to be, no matter who wins or who loses. So you just have to accept that.
but at least we need a sound defense that we have acted legally and appropriately in making the decision.
Oh, couldn't agree more.
And sometimes that's a concept that's very difficult for neighbors to understand.
Sometimes it's a concept for applicants to understand.
All right, where are we from your standpoint?
I'm good if you're good.
You're finished?
Yes, I am.
Okay, any further questions for Dean? Counselor Bowens?
I have a comment, and I think this is the time to bring it up. If anybody thinks I'm out of line, I'll wait for the city council meeting. But I think that we ought to have the discussion in this year's budget about an economic development person who is on board for Laconia. I think we ought to at least have that discussion and what kind of value that would be, not only to the planning department, but to other departments as well, in terms of the value it could be. It may be that it's not cost-effective, but when we've got a master plan in which we've been proactive in searching ways to foster economic development, and we affirmatively address that in our vision statement and in our land use statement, we ought to be thinking about how we can complement that with an actual City of Laconia economic development individual. Just my thoughts and comments.
All right, Counselor Lippman?
I guess, not so much on that one, but what came out of the master plan was making sure that, or land use chapter discussion was to make sure that we did a check against, the budget versus what that's coming up. I'm not close enough to the mic, thanks. I think what we had talked about in the land use master planning process is to make sure that we do a cross-check against the budget to make sure that there's alignment between what we're promoting in that with the way we're budgeting. And so I think I'd ask that we, before we close the process on the planning department, that we sort of look at how that has come through in the budget or hasn't, and then take that up as a discussion item.
Personally,
into
Counselor
deliberation.
Bowens, I would, I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, I'm just saying as we get into the deliberative session is to be able to have that discussion.
So I hope we're keeping a working list of things to discuss in deliberative. Counselor Bounds, I would actually look forward to that discussion. I have had innumerable people over the years suggest that to me. I have frankly not agreed with them, but I'm all ears. I'm open to the possibility. I think if for no other reason that I think that traditionally communities have looked at the economic development department director, or whatever you want to call it, as a savior, a Hail Mary kind of position, and they rarely pay off. And I think as a general truism, the time you really need an economic development director is when your economy is steaming along like crazy and you just can't keep it's not possible for the employees you already have to keep up with all the people that want to come to your town, as opposed to trying to find somebody in Alaska who's worried, who's willing to move to Laconia someday, that sort of thing.
I'm not being an advocate for an economic development person or against it. I just think
But I think it is an interesting discussion.
that we need to have
I know
that
there are lots of
discussion.
people that I listen to in the community who think that that's a real need. So,
Well, I listen to, it's a real need and it's a waste of time all the time. So we all get the pros and cons on that issue.
if we get to that and have that discussion, I'd like to have Carmen Lorenz join us some night and weigh in on that. Because it's been her field and she was a state economic development director.
Carmen?
and-
Carmen, did you say? Carmen Lorenz? Okay.
And I think she approaches it with a very common sense, from a very common sense perspective and a sense of reality, as opposed to pie in the sky dreaming and whatnot as to what can be done and what can't be done.
Perfect person. Let's invite her to the table.
So, all right, any other questions for Dean? We thank you very much for coming,
Thank you.
and thank you also to our new building inspector. Thank you. And if there's no objection, I'm going to declare this meeting adjourned at 6:55 PM. We'll reconvene at 7.
Guys, I'll do